So, Matthew 11, starting in verse 27. This is Jesus speaking. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So, when I was praying about what to talk about, what tonight was supposed to be about, the thing that God kept saying was about him as the refuge for us and our souls. And there's a lot that comes with that. You know, on the one hand, there's talking about the reality of God's character as a person. Last week, it was brought up about how, you know, in terms of going back to the topic of spiritual warfare and how the two things that get attacked most often above everything else are either our identities or God's identity. With each individual person, the way that demons come at us, the way that Satan comes at us, is to try to diminish the value of one of these two things, one of these two characters in our lives. It's either to remove your uniqueness, your value, to make you look around and tell yourself, or look around at other people and tell yourself that you're not good enough and that they're all better than you, to remove any and all value of yourself and who you are, so that you're willing to be able to be manipulated and moved here and there, and so you can look at God and tell him, I'm not worthy, and you can look at, you know, the darkest parts of yourself and say, this is the quantum of who I am. Just to kind of harken back to last week's message, that's one of the big things. It's one of the biggest things that we run into. But the other big thing is to do the same with God. To take his image and make him into something that he's not. Using any means necessary in order to turn him into a monster, a judge, or to turn him into somebody weak or vacant, for lack of a better word. Essentially, it becomes the kind of thing where we want to take him and make him the villain in a story about him, as it were. And there's a lot to unpack, you know, in terms of learning God's character. The first thing to address is just the reality of the lies that are so pervasive. There are all kinds of things where this world has so many different stories, so many different things that tell us that God is not. And there are a lot of systems in place to kind of feed into that. You know, like, there are a lot of cultures, and there are a lot of other cultures and other civilizations that have, and other religions, and all these different components of life, and they have their own narratives, their own stories of how life works. And they have their gods that they venerate, or their individuals that they venerate, or all these different things that they look to, and they build up. And some of them have like legitimate spiritual somethingness to be attached to that. Some of them are as dry as a man standing before an idol and saying what he wants, and willing it to come forward and doing his best to do that, you know? But there are other ones that have some actual substance to them. People don't come to witchcraft, for example, and practice witchcraft and do the spells and go through the processes just because they want it to work, what makes them stick is that usually there's some form of experience that tells them this works. They feel something, or they see something. It becomes real. So there's something to that. Back in the olden days, there were a lot of cultures that developed gods based on circumstance. The Greek gods were all petty and selfish and pushy and arrogant, and that's what you would expect from a people that look at the world through a lens when the environment is against you at all points in time. Anything that you associate with the world around you, with nature, is going to come across that way. Storms bring good things and bad things. The ocean brings good things and bad things. It's going to seem moody. So at the end of the day, we have all these different kinds of systems in place to kind of bring another avenue, another aspect of life. I think one of the most intriguing, and one that was brought back over and over again to point out, was when I was into Satanism. I remember picking up and reading a Satanic Bible, and the story that they give of Lucifer, it effectively mirrors the Prometheus myth from ancient Greece, which is the story that Prometheus went to the gods and stole fire and gave it to men. The difference is that in the Luciferian story, it's that Lucifer went to God and stole magic and gave it to men. God was hoarding it all for himself because he was proud and selfish. And Satan liberated it so that men could experience it, so that human beings, I should say, could utilize it. And the thing about it is that we have to talk about experience in any kind of discussion about this, because the systems are there, they're already set in place, but none of us really controls those things. I didn't manifest any of the Celtic pantheon or anything like that. It's just an option that sits outside of my purview that can be something that I could grab onto. If somebody wants to worship Egyptian gods or worship other gods, they have that option available to them. What ultimately dictates that we push or go in any particular direction tends to be our personal experiences. And just to be clear, like, those gods, those idols, those different things aren't even always necessarily the things that we worship. Earlier today, I was posting about the way that in America we worship success, and how that ends up being an idol for us. It's a cultural system. It's a perspective that we carry. And as such, that dictates a lot of how we value things. If something is not successful, we don't value it. If it's not successful in the way that we want it to be successful, or that we deem successful, we'll wash it aside. It doesn't matter how real it is, how true it is, how good it is. What matters is that it's not doing what it's supposed to do in our perspective. And there are a lot of different concepts that can become worshipped. But the point is that when we talk about experience, the truth is that a lot of us have experiences that tell us that God is not who he is. See, when I was younger, the reason why I got into Satanism was because of a perspective of God. And it was the idea that, that heaven was not a place for people to be who they are. It wasn't a place where people were free. Instead, it was a place where people were effectively automatons. Because in my mind, when I was very young, the only way that people would ever be able to be as good as God wanted them to be was if their free will was removed. Only then could they actually accomplish the goal of being that good, of following that many rules, of serving in that capacity. Because as long as they had free will, they were never going to choose to do that. Because that's not how people are. At least that was my perspective. On top of that, there was the whole idea that God already knew who was going to be saved and who wasn't. that kind of Calvinistic idea of, if God already knows, then the number's set. And if the number's set, then there's nothing you can really do about it. You're either going to be saved or you're not going to be saved. You're either in or out. And there's nothing that you can do about that because that is already set. Events will happen as they're going to happen in order to put you either on the side for him or the side against him. And that is all. So, with the perspective that God didn't actually want people for themselves, but wanted automatons, and the perspective that God had already established how many were going to be there and how many weren't, and therefore didn't care enough to move beyond that, it was easy to end up finding myself in a place where I determined that I was not one to be saved. Looking at myself and my perspective of myself and who I was and how I acted and what I wanted, I was very selfish and deceptive and very cruel. So obviously I was not going to be somebody who was going to go to heaven. So my experience up to that point in time had led me to believe all of these things. The interpretation of God that I had was something that I had learned from other people, that I had been taught. It wasn't necessarily what I had experienced with him, because quite frankly, I hadn't had any clear experiences with him at that point in time. So I ended up moving into a place of serving the enemy. I ended up seeing demons and talking to them and learning how to manipulate and deceive and do all kinds of little things. My experiences ended up being more with different demons, like Balak and Beelzebub and Satan himself, who preferred to be called Lucifer. So I developed in response to them and what they taught me to do and be. And my experience ended up being that, well, this is how they are. And at the end of that time, I had to kind of face the reality that I didn't really like what I'd become. I didn't really like that I was a skilled liar and deceiver, that I was so good at manipulation. But I was good at it, so I figured that was kind of my lot in life. So my experience told me to just stay there. So the thing of it is that experience can be that kind of thing where it kind of tells you. And, my person was broken down after my perspective of God had been broken down. And what ended up saving me was eventually God gave me a dream that kind of snapped me out of what I was really doing. I had this whole justification built up in my head that I was doing what I was doing to serve God. I was going to go out and get all these Christians, these fake Christians, to give up on their faith so that the real Christians could be seen and they could save the world.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I would use all those skills of deception and manipulation in order to try to get these people to give up. And then when I succeeded, well, I didn't feel good about it, but I did what I was supposed to do. And I always remember the one where it was a friend of mine. I was pushed and led to go convince her to kill herself. So I did. And I spent 10 years believing that I had succeeded at that. It wasn't until 10 years later that I found her on Facebook. And mind you, I'd searched for her a few different times because I wasn't sure. I just had some other friend of ours tell me that she did this. So I spent all that time believing all these things about myself, all as kind of a domino effect of this one thing that I held in belief as true. And the reason why I share all of that is partly to kind of give life to what I'm talking about here. If one of those identities falls, the other will follow. Because that's ultimately the move that's against us, always and forever. And when we lose sight of who God is, especially, what's the purpose? There has to be something inside of us that drives us forward and makes us want to be something else. And the funny thing about it is that the thing that can ultimately strengthen us the most, even if we develop in defiance, we say, well, I'm still going to be the best, even though I don't believe that God's there for me. It's still a response to God. It's just a different kind. But it's one that makes us very, very... It makes us very, very dangerously open to things like pride and ego that can really screw us up as we try to be that very best. It creates a sort of open door. Now, the thing of it is just to kind of go off that point of experience. You know, my experience with Satan himself made the whole Luciferian story that I read very amusing, but ultimately laughable, because I knew Satan before I knew God. I knew his character. He taught me how to lie. And brutal truth is that he taught me how to tell those kinds of lies, to make him look like a hero and God look like a villain. And even explaining the fact that that was just for the fun of screwing up these people. And like the thing of it is that when it comes down to talking about character, I cannot profess to you exactly what it's like to talk to him with the wall of pride and selfishness that he is, but just how skilled he is through gaslighting and other things like that in order to diminish you in the face of whoever you think you're supposed to be, and to push you forward and propel you into places of darkness. If you know who you are, you can stand up to this so easily, but if you don't, you'll crumble so fast. He's good at what he does. And if you know who God is, you can stand up so much more easily to what he does. But if you don't, one of the things that I most often had told to do was to use the Bible as a tool to further destroy these people's faith. It wasn't hard. All I had to know was just enough. A little bit of condemnation here, a little bit of condemnation there, a couple of judgments, some things out of context, and their faith was destroyed. Because the truth is that all of us, all of our foundations of God are built on a number of different things, and none of them are actually God's character. Most of us come with pasts of churches that taught us about being good enough for him, or doing enough. It's not your heart, it's the things you do. Because it's a pervasive element of human wisdom, especially in our culture, that says you're defined by what you do and not by who you are. A lot of people talk about how, in our culture, modern day, a lot of people get down on the kind of culture that we have that's built off of like sexual preferences. We develop identities based on our sexual preferences, our sexual identity. Before that, our identity was based off of other things. Like, the truth of the matter is that I don't know any time in the last 50, 60, 70 years of our culture that anybody's character has been based on their character. If you're gay, in our modern day and age, you have to act a certain way.
Why are you pointing at me?
I wasn't intentional.
Because you're newlyweds. He's the most comfortable with you.
Clearly.
Oh, you're defensive.
Yeah.
Stand up for your man.
You just complained about getting some, so there you go.
So, if you're gay, you have to act a certain way. Like, that is what our culture tells us.
Don't look at me.
If you're trans, you have to act a certain way. Before that, and there's a whole, like, identity that comes with that. This whole little clump of characteristics that are lumped on you. You know, if your sign in the stars says one thing, if your MBTI is one thing, if your job is one thing, if you're a server, you're like this, if you're an electrician, you're like this. In the 40s and 50s, people built their identities not on their person, but on their job. You were defined by your occupation. We still see that. All plumbers have their butt cracks out, and they act a certain way. All garbage men act a certain way. And the truth is that we all know. Have fun with that, Jeremy.
Yeah.
The truth of the matter is that that's not really fair to anybody ever. Defining who we are based off of those objectionable things, they don't really, or those subjective things, it doesn't quantify a person. It's not fair. We know that, but we do it. We've been taught to do this. When the truth of the matter is that what God has always kind of looked at for us for is who we are. When we talk about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the fruit of the Holy Spirit is a collection of characteristics. Okay? Love, joy, patience, peace, just as examples. They aren't jobs, they aren't identities in those regards. The identity comes from this being a part of you. So in that same vein, because we're so inclined to stereotype, we end up doing the same thing with God. So we create stereotypes of him. Jesus has a stereotype. Just depends on which group of people you talk to. When I used to listen to the old pastor of Mars Hills Church, he painted Jesus, he specifically highlighted Jesus' angry side because he was an angry man. Everything about him was angry. His messages were hellfire and brimstone, raging and angry. He talked about his own personal issues with anger and talked about where it was okay to be angry, and then looked at Jesus in that same light. He said, Jesus was angry. He flipped over tables and chased people out of the temple that one time. And because of that one time, he quantified all of Jesus' character and summed him up. The church leaders at other places highlight different aspects of Jesus' character, the ones that they identify with, in order to build him. And anybody that comes and listens to those messages, and anybody that comes and takes that in as this is truth, they'll find truths, but they'll also find a limited aspect of it, because it's not pulling in the whole of a character. The same is true with God. We do this all the time. How are we supposed to see God as a refuge when all that we see him as is a brutal judge who's just defining our worth based off of what we do? Parables like the prodigal son mean nothing to those types of people. If everything's based on your adherence to the law, the prodigal son means nothing. It's a nice story, and maybe it feels good for a moment, but you just kind of reset back to where you were. And as a result of that, God is still a monster, and he doesn't care about anything that you are. All he cares about is what you do. And ultimately, verses like this one, where Jesus talks so clearly and so specifically, calling us all forward into a place of peace and refuge and protection where we can be safe, and we can be cared for, that just rings hollow, because God's a monster. So we end up having to talk about these particular issues, and if we're going to talk about God as a person, there's a lot to look at. So we'll go ahead and take a break for a moment before we get into that, just so people can go to the bathroom and such. So to continue on, talking about the perspectives of God. The biggest things that we run into are that, there's what we experience and there's also what we're taught. And that can really mold our view of him. And like I was saying, that will destroy anything that's brought up, or it will build it up into something it's not. See, the thing of it is that we talk about experience because that is where we learn who God is as an individual, as a person. I'm going to say that a lot, as a person, and people might somewhere deep down inside somebody, they might have that little thing that says, you can't do that because God's not a person, it's God.
Fully man, fully God.
I'm going to use the word person over and over and over again to bring home the fact that God has his own identity, and the only way that a lot of us understand that is when we think of somebody in terms of being another person. It's the same way that when we talked about spiritual warfare and we talked about demons, we talked about them as their own persons. Each one has their own character, their own identity, their own presence.
Yeah.
Personality.
God has his own personality. We don't actually we don't just come up with one.
Right.
In our heads, or just
Right.
That's why testimony is so important. You start hearing about what he's like from other people, because they have had experiences with him.
Right.
It always leads to you wanting more.
So, the thing of it is that a long time ago, before I go there, we'll talk about some kind of elements of perspective and specifically things that do stand in the way of seeing him for who he is. So let's talk about Old Testament God for a minute. The thing of it is that a lot of people worship Old Testament God. And I know that's not really the appropriate way to describe him, because God is the same as he was. He's always been the same. The problem that we run into is the perspective that's offered. When Moses wrote his books, he offered his perspective. It's the same thing that we run into with the Gospels. It's why the story of, Jesus' resurrection is very different between the 4 different Gospels. Matthew wrote his Gospel long after everyone else. He was one of the last ones to put that forward. Luke and Mark weren't even there. Mark followed around Peter and learned from Peter, and he got the story from Peter. Luke quantified the whole story from talking to the various different apostles and disciples and different people that were there. And then there's John, who wrote his own while he was in prison. Even so, they had years removed. Ultimately, you could say that John's perspective was probably the most pertinent, since he was the one that was actually there. And then you can go from there and you can see that Mark, who was talking to Peter, a lot of their perspective aligns. But the point is that it's a matter of perspective, and that's what we run into. It's why some of the stories are even jumbled a little bit, because they're writing from memory or from stories that they've heard. Which brings us to the Old Testament and talks about that. Because at the end of the day, we're going to run into a very similar problem when we read about, read Chronicles, Kings, different books like that. Even the various books written by Moses, he's going to be sharing his perspective. And Jesus says an interesting thing, and it's something that's very important for us to remember, and it's that we can only go so far as our teachers. See, whoever your teacher is, you can only get as good or as intelligent or as whatever as your teacher. So their perspective, their understanding of things is what's always going to be a limiting factor in what you can receive from them. So in Jesus's thing, it's why he talked about how ultimately he said that we only had one teacher, and that teacher was supposed to be himself, God. So for us, like looking at these examples, in the Old Testament we read stories about things that God did. And mind you, when we read the Psalms, we also see a perspective of how people viewed God. I believe David's words were, "Blessed is the man who dashes his enemy's head on a rock." Some people take the more literal interpretation that every word in the Bible is from God. That creates a lot of problems when you have Jesus saying, it's a sin to even look at somebody in anger. That would be a strange kind of contradiction, wouldn't it? And I bring all this up because it's an important thing when we come to learning who God is. Because there are going to be things like that the way that we approach even the Bible can actually limit our ability to even know who God is. When I first, there was a point in time where I got tired of reading Paul and reading Peter and reading John and reading the Old Testament. And I just wanted to, I wasn't hearing from God at that point in time, so I just wanted to, for once, know what God was about as a person. So I specifically focused on parts where God himself talked. Even if it wasn't perfect, I still was going to look at these parts. So I read the Gospels and I read the prophets. The prophets being the parts where these guys were just sharing the words that God gave to them. And Jesus sharing the Gospels sharing the words what Jesus gave. And the thing was that it was in order to try to ascertain some understanding of who it was that I'm supposed to be worshiping, who it is that I believe in, as opposed to always just going off of, third-party perspectives or different things like that. Like this, I'm listening to this pastor who read this thing by Paul, who learned this thing from Jesus, and it's just like, I want to just go to the source, okay? So I read these things in order to try to better understand who God is and his character. And I got taken later to books like Chronicles, Kings, and so on, because it helped kind of flesh out an understanding of not only who God is, but how he interacts with the world, and how it's not always so blunt in terms of, okay, you read about the story of Hezekiah where he sends Isaiah the prophet to tell Hezekiah, you're going to die. Put your things in order, get everything ready, you're going to die. It's your time. And then Isaiah leaves, and Hezekiah turns, he prays, and he asks God for more time. God tells Isaiah to turn around, which he does. He's in the courtyard by this time. Turn around and go tell Hezekiah this. You're going to be given some extra years. Here's a fig. We're going to make a poultice out of it, and it's going to cure your illness. The thing is that there's a lot more give and take than what we understand with God. There's a lot more of him meeting us where we're at. We don't really look at that a whole lot. We don't get that a lot from reading the Old Testament in the way that we do. Because a lot of what we focus on are the laws. We focus on the things that are scary. We focus on the story when the brothers touch the ark and die. We focus on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We focus on the story of Noah, where God wiped out the whole world and left it with only Noah and his family to rebuild because the world had become so fallen. We look at all these things and we say, man, look at what God did. Look at how many people he's killed. And oftentimes I think we miss exactly how far things had to go before God was even willing to do that. Because we don't always look at the world for what it is. when we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah specifically, because that ends up being a good example, because it's the only one where where there's really a description of what Sodom and Gomorrah was like before he sent fire from heaven to destroy the city. This was the kind of place where when God sent two of his own angels to go talk to Lot, they went in, talked to Lot, and immediately the entire population of men in the city came out and waited on Lot's door and said, hey, bring those two guys out, we want to have sex with them. When a city gets to a point where the entire population's response to visitors is to gang rape them, that's a pretty dark place.
Yeah, he's not a loving God if he allows that to take over.
And that's the other thing, is there is this kind of dramatic effect that happens where when a culture gets to a point like that, it creates more of its own.
Yeah.
I always remember this episode of all things Firefly, where they have this, and for those unfamiliar, it doesn't matter. The point is the story. The story goes that there are these crazy people that live in space, and they've just kind of been, they're called Reavers, yes. They just kind of, they do terrible things. They've been driven mad. And the thing is that they'll attack other spaceships moving through the area, and they'll do twisted things. They'll kill the people and like strap them to the outsides of the ship, all mangled and contorted and twisted. And one time they find one of those ships that's been attacked like that, and there's a survivor. And the thing that the captain of their ship ends up talking about is how sometimes the only way that somebody survives an ordeal like seeing that much bad happen is to become the same thing. And this is something that we see psychologically when we talk about children who've grown up in abusive homes or under constant strain of just sexual, mental, emotional, physical abuse. We know the recipe to create a sociopath or a psychopath. It's just equal parts abuse and neglect. And then they go on to be a sick individual who does things. So in this particular instance, yeah, God wiped out this city to stop that from spreading. And we look at it in terms of like, the world, there are a lot of people who will paint that as a perspective of, okay, well, God did this malicious thing, why didn't he save them? Well, because free will is still a thing. You can't talk about God's character without talking about our free will. And this is something that doesn't get translated very well in the Old Testament, is the will of the individuals. Everyone says, look what God did. But very few people say, look at how these people were, look at what was happening. In the prophets, you hear God, you get speaking passionately from his perspective and what things were supposed to be and what he wanted to do. And it sounds brutal at times. But that's the point, is that when we talk without filter, in open and passionate language, it can sound brutal. It can sound harsh. That's for anybody. I'm not going to name names, but there's one person that I can think of in particular right now sitting across from me who, when they start talking about things, they can really get into it and they can really come across in a lot of ways, but what's the undertone is the passion that they have for what they're talking about. And that's the thing that we end up seeing a lot of times with God and the prophets, is that he cares deeply. And this affects him deeply that the Israelites are choosing to go against him. I always remember the line in Jeremiah, I never even entered into my mind to ask you to sacrifice your own children. He had to explain that to them in the midst of just being deeply affected by the choices that they were making. I don't think we always recognize just how dark the world has been at times and what was being dealt with. And this wasn't something that was just the way it was something that they chose to make happen over and over and over again. So he had to meet them where they were at and try to call them forth from that. We don't have that as much these days. Like, we can make arguments, I hear it all the time, of like, okay, well, what about abortion? Like, that's equatable to sacrifice, right? Not really, okay? Like, yeah, there's things with that, but there's a big difference between a scared mom giving up her baby versus a pair of parents going down to the local temple with their newborn child and throwing him on the burning hot hands of Baal in order to have until he dies so that they can have trade agreements go through. The difference between that, there's a gulf there. And that's the thing, is like we need to understand like what our choices look like, what our perspectives look like, what our justifications look like. Because the thing of it is that God's meeting us where we're at and trying to call us out of it. And sometimes that's a really deep hole. And sometimes he has to be harsh in order to wake us up. It's the same thing that you run into with when you interact with people yourself. Some people are so wrapped up in themselves that they don't respond to you politely and gently talking to them. You have to effectively cut in and say, shut up, or move, do good things, stop. You know, they have to have that thing in order for them to clue in. So we find ourselves looking at a lot of that with God, where he's had to do that a lot. And that ends up being a lot of the story of the Old Testament. Even Jesus references it in the New Testament when he talks about how people were at the time. He talks about how, when it's in the discussion about divorce, when he talks about how back in the day, you know, you were given the ability to give a certificate of divorce and so on. But he was just like, but that wasn't the ideal. You were given this because your hearts were hard. And that's a thing, kind of a perspective on where people were at and where God had to meet them where they were at before being able to finally say, okay, this is what I really want from you guys. What I really want is this heart. What I really want is for you to be here. Sometimes people aren't ready to receive, an ideal until a later point in time. Things have to mellow out before they can even get to that place. And God knows that better than anybody else. So, what about God himself in this? Like, there's a lot of in response to who we are. And there's a lot of us painting him how we want to see him. What is he really like? Well, the truth of the matter is that God describes himself at different times in the scriptures. And when Jesus comes, he talks about how, he shares himself, his own person, his feelings, his desires. And he shares the desires of his Father. And he talks about how if you've seen him, then you've seen the Father. He clarifies this point about how, he is who he is. And it's when we look at that, when we start to pay attention to, who Jesus is and what he was about, bringing peace. But also, there are hard things that he brings as well. Questions of what do you really want? Even, some of them can seem particularly difficult. You remember the story about the man who came to Jesus and he was like, I want to follow you, but first let me go bury my dad. And Jesus' response was, let the dead bury the dead and follow me. Like, from our minds, that can seem like a really difficult thing. It's just like, well, why couldn't you just let him go bury his dad? Like, that's kind of a big deal. But it was a point of priorities, seeing where somebody's heart was really at. So there were challenges that Jesus offered just as much as there was peace that he offered, just as much as he came trying to bring comfort and clarity and understanding. He always functioned in truth. Always functions in truth. And even last week we talked about from John 16 about the Holy Spirit and receiving that, the counselor. The truth is that the Holy Spirit will bring stuff to us that might be difficult to swallow sometimes because it can be completely counter to all those systems that we live in. My culture says this is how this works. Well, if you go to other cultures, they say something different. Maybe that's because it's subjective instead of laid out flat. And then you have the Holy Spirit telling you something that's completely different. And I bring up Jesus and the Holy Spirit again because the truth is that they and God are all intertwined with one another. To know one is to know them all. Their characters coalesce. And then when we talk about God the Father and just the reality of how much he wants, like I don't think we always think about the truth that the entire story of the Bible is one of him trying to redeem us back to what was lost in Genesis. Everything that God does all throughout is trying to set up and prepare and make things work to bring us back to a certain place, which is close to him and in communion with him. That ends up being what his heart ends up being. Like, it's what he pushes for all the time. Is just for us to be able to drop all this worldly stuff aside, and even to recognize what it is. I mean, when we talk about things that matter and don't matter, values, there's a lot that we value that God doesn't. And there's a lot that God values that we devalue because of whatever system, whatever culture. Again, in America, success isn't a thing. God might tell us to do something that's not going to be successful in the way that we think it should be. Go give this message about what's true. Okay, well, that's not going to put bodies in our church. That's not going to make us financially successful. That's not going to do all these different things. Okay, it's not about any of that. It's about telling the truth and feeding the bodies that are there. So this ends up being kind of the thing that we have to go through, is just learning those values. And that's something that comes through experience with God. And we'll stop here for a moment.
Hungry and my food.
Too late.
Anyway, so yeah, in the face of everything that we've talked about tonight, in terms of, personal perspectives and the way that those can adjust, and systems that exist to kind of point us in one direction or another, the last thing to talk about here is God's character, his own person. And the value of this is, as I was just saying off screen, is that it gives us a guideline in terms of knowing, if we hear from him, does this sound like something he'd actually say? Is it actually within his character to hate the person who I hate or love the person who I love? Is it within his character, if I'm hearing something or thinking that it's from him, or even if I'm being a Christian and going about my life as I think that I'm supposed to, even the culture of Christianity that I'm growing up in, is this actually a God thing Like, I say that this is God breathed because I'm told this is God breathed, but is it actually? And these are the kinds of questions that we have to grapple with, and if we don't have a knowledge of God's character, we're going to grapple with them in the wrong direction. We're going to fight with them and come up with our own conclusions, and our own conclusions can be scary. Because that's how you get like Westboro Baptist,
Right.
where they're preaching hate, and it's so easy, if you know God, to pick apart the things that they're saying and point out to them why they're wrong, where they're off. I mean, you have Jesus. So many times he went to the Pharisees and told them, first of all, understand what this means. Love mercy. And take care of the women and the widows and orphans.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was Jesus telling these religious leaders who were like, you know, we paint the Pharisees under a specific light. We kind of look at them as being like the worst of the worst in terms of religious leaders. And that's right and wrong at the same time. It's true that some of them were like that. Some of them also were not. But the biggest thing that the Pharisees serve to exist as is a mirror for what happens when religion is allowed to function without God.
Whoa, that's a big statement. That's good.
The Jews, the Jews during the time when the Pharisees really got to rise up, had completely forgotten who God was. They had the law, and they had the law, and that's it.
But question though is, I mean, they're using the law and like God-breathed texts and stuff, and you know, you're saying that the Pharisees didn't have God in the church,
Right.
and you know they're going off of all they can. You know, these are God-breathed words, and they don't have God. I mean,
They were
they're
against people.
right.
That's what I'm getting at. Like, even to answer your question specifically, like, even if they have just God-breathed stuff, they can lose the intent behind it when they lose God. So, for example, one example where they came after Jesus was, I talked about this one not long ago, but his disciples they were eating with unwashed hands. And what the Jews were demanding was of Jesus, because they were getting after him for that, but what they were saying that his men should be doing are going through this ritual cleaning process to make themselves unclean before the Lord, then they could eat their food. And Jesus turns around and brings up to them the fact that, you know, the Pharisees at that point in time, they were taking these particular set of laws out of context called the Corban laws, which were, you know, when you do something for God. But what they were doing was they were taking times and like, okay, so what you guys are doing is you're taking property, or when your parents ask you for help with something, and you say, oh, well, the money that I would give to my parents, I will instead give to God. Therefore, I don't have to help my parents. And then they could use that money later on for themselves.
Motive.
But because of the Corban laws, it said, you know, with the law just in and of itself, without the spirit of it behind it, what they were left with was this idea of, okay, this is okay, this is justifiable to do this. Even though it's morally reprehensible, it's wrong, and it's certainly not something that God himself would be okay with, without God being a part of the equation. Even though you've taken his words, you've also taken them out of the context and away from him, and built them into whatever you wanted to do. And that ended up being kind of the rebuke that he laid out for them. So even with the Ten Commandments, anything that we read in the Bible, it's why I'm talking about this point of like, even though I use the Bible in these messages and so on, when it comes down to talking about God's character, like we can read so much, but the biggest truth that I can say and that we'll get to is that, you know, you can only ever really get to know God by getting to know him in person.
Experience.
And your experiences with him will help you understand better than anything else. But we have some to work with. And the truth is that it's when our hearts are really like given over in that sense of, well, just that, like when they're given over to him. And there's that process that happens where we get to know him, and he comes to meet us, and it becomes this thing where we kind of grow together further.
What do you do if you feel that that experience is being withheld from you?
Right, yeah.
And that's why we're talking about God's character,
Yeah.
because that ends up being kind of like it ends up being kind of a good fallback, I guess, in a way, to say, okay, well, this is what he's done in the past, this is who he is.
Yeah.
Now the experience is being withheld, but sometimes we feel something is being withheld even though it's not actually being withheld.
Yeah.
And we just can't see it.
Our heart's just not ready, or whatever.
Well, sometimes it's that our heart's not ready. Sometimes it's just that we're blind to it. Like,
Yeah.
I know for myself at times, there have been plenty of things where when I look back on them, I can see where God was meeting me and helping me. But I didn't feel like it at the time.
Yeah.
I didn't feel he was there. I felt abandoned. I mean, to give a specific example, I remember when I was going to college and I was just begging him to help me pass tests, begging him to help me like retain the knowledge that I was just pouring into myself as much as I could when I was studying for those tests, for those classes and so on. And, you know, I kept asking him, God, I kept saying to him, God, if you want me to go and become a zoologist, help me do this. Well, maybe the answer was no to that. Like, as hard as it
And you pursued it still.
as hard as it was to accept that, the answer to his the answer to that prayer was, no, I don't want you to be a zoologist. But I couldn't accept that. I couldn't see it. I was so stuck on what I was doing and what I was supposed to be doing that I couldn't appreciate that he was answering my prayers.
Yeah.
So my experience told me that God wasn't there and wasn't going to help me.
So our perception can even trick us into feeling like his presence is being withheld
Right.
from us or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
So, just to give that as an example of one thing in particular, you know, from my own experience, and that was a struggle for a long time of just like wondering if God was really absentee or not.
Yeah.
Feeling so wholeheartedly that I was supposed to be this one thing, but ultimately that not being true, not being what I was supposed to be. And in retrospect now, when I look back on it, I would have been miserable. Like when I've looked into different things, like there have been so many times over the past 10 years that I've read papers from different zoologists, you know, whatever it is that they're studying, whether it's reptiles, amphibians, fish, you know, and I get so frustrated by what they're doing, how they're doing it, where it's like, this isn't about truth. What are you guys doing?
Yeah.
It's like
they have to
there's-
adhere to like a set of rules
Right,
that are almost like rules of a religion.
right. And that ended up being like a big thing that has caught me up in the past, where I'm just like, maybe it was for the best that I didn't end up in that world.
Yeah.
Maybe I was only headed towards heartache and frustration and anger, especially learning about the requirements, being a doctor, which was I was going for. So the point is just this, like in hindsight, you know, I can see why things were set up the way they were, but at that point in time, that wasn't easy. I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
So,
Perception.
and that ends up being another big thing, is like, if we know who somebody is, we have friends and family and different people in our lives where we can, by knowing who they are, we can get past a lot of what might seem objectionable things. If you have a friend who is very shy, but the way that they interact with other people, like they can come across as cold when, you know,
Oh, yeah. No,
They're-
that's happened to me.
right.
People
They-
thought I was rude and cold, but I was just so freaking timid and shy.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be seen. Yeah. I
Yeah.
didn't talk until 6th grade. I was like what do they call it? When you're a mute, but it's because you choose it. It's not because you can't talk.
You're aloof.
No, a mute.
Well, no, aloof is
Oh.
like, you know, my brother was kind of similar, like, he would kind of, basically kind of look down his nose at people, or it was perceived that way, but he
Yeah.
wasn't talking a lot, just didn't
Yeah.
really kind of seem distant,
Yep.
you know?
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
Yeah.
No, that's it. It can look one way, but we never know what's behind that, why that person is appearing the way they are.
Right.
Perception.
Yeah.
You can't just, yeah.
So that's kind of the point, is that, you know, if I have a friend who's like that, or a wife in this case, and, you know, we meet some people and they, you know, that person comes across as rude or shy or whatever because they're shy, you know, I can advocate for that person. You know, if the person that we're meeting feels like they've been brushed off or like they was being rude or whatever, I can say, actually, no. Just as much as when something happens between us, I can know, okay, you know, they're not like that.
Take two.
Take two. Yeah. So, in essence, like, it ends up being the kind of thing where, you know, when we were going through all that stuff, you know, knowing who you are was what was able to help me get past some of those issues where I thought, you know, the rumors that went around from the church that we were part of, where they were claiming that, you know, she was the kind of person that would cheat on me and things like that.
Fuck them.
Right.
It was hard.
And it was just like, with that kind of mess, that knowing who you were
Yeah.
was what allowed me to get past that hurdle.
Yeah.
So that's why it's important to, like, know who somebody is, why, and even talking about God, why it's important to know who he is and what he's really about. And just to get to it instead of talking around it, he's about relationship.
Yeah.
That is the thing that he matters most to him in everything. You'll hear people say all kinds of things about what God values most is righteousness. I heard one guy talk about how what God values most is purity. And that's not true. What God values most is relationship. And if you want examples of that, you know, we already touched on the fact that, well, I think we already touched on it. I don't know if it was conversation outside, if it was during the message, but we touched on the fact that in Genesis, you know, the big issue in Genesis was about the loss of relationship. And that was why Adam and Eve had to be pulled out of the garden. If it had just been, you know, disobedience, if they had simply been lied to, you know, being deceived by the serpent, or, you know, that would have been enough. And it would have been okay, maybe.
But they took his word over God's.
But they trusted him over God.
Yeah.
And then they reacted by acting like God wasn't who he was. They hid from him because he was going to punish them or something. And even in the text, he was confused by that.
Yeah.
And the point was, and confused in the sense that they were acting in a way that they should have known they didn't need to.
Yeah.
But that mistrust ran so deep. And that's the thing, is that, you know, for God, it's always been about relationship. Everything that he's done throughout the course of time has been to bring us back to that. You know, whether it's, you know, in the case of the law, like, there are a lot of different things about that, but the intent behind it was to bring people close to him once more. With Jesus' coming, Jesus came exemplifying a relationship with God and what that looked like, that proximity, where he talked about how just the way that him and the Father were so unified,
Mm-hmm.
and they were so completely within each other. And John 17 is just a prayer where Jesus prays for us to be able to have the same thing and to really exist in that, because that's God's heart. Think of that chapter as being God's personal prayer for us. And you will find so much in there about what he values. Even in the, oh God, and even in terms of it being about relationship, you think of the story of Jonah. Jonah was a prophet who was routinely disobeying God. The entire book of Jonah is Jonah effectively saying, or God saying, I want you to go do a thing, and Jonah saying no, and then running away. You know, whether it was when he first ran away he was told to go to Nineveh, he ran away, hopped on a boat, went out into the boat. Even when the waves came, and the fishermen were and the people on the boat were panicking, he knew. He went to them and was like, just throw me overboard. God's just mad, it's not a big deal. Throw me overboard, I'll be fine.
It's not you, it's me.
Yeah. So they throw him overboard, and he gets swallowed by the fish or whale or whatever the interpretation wants to be these days. And he lived, and he was fine.
Yeah, he knew that God would harm him. That's
Right.
because he was close to him.
Exactly.
He knew, God's intentions toward him and how they don't change because of what he's doing or not doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just like, in a lot of ways, Jonah, despite his rebelliousness, he knew God.
Yeah.
And God knew him. And in that relationship, that's what matters. That whole thing about, you know that God loves you because you're not dead, that's such bull. Like, that's not even true. What it is that God loves you, and that's it. And the thing of it is that he was never going to kill Jonah. He was never going to harm Jonah. He wanted Jonah to know him, and they did.
Yeah.
And even though Jonah was not an obedient man, God still protected him and took care of him.
Mhm.
Because at the heart of God is relationship, and that's what matters most. When Jesus rebuked the Pharisees, he rebuked them with issues of, relationship. Whether we talk about the Corban laws or we talk about when he goes to them saying, know these words. Everything that he brought to them was about just the value of relationship. He exemplified community with his disciples. Even when we talk about, like, God talking about himself in Exodus 33. Uh, 19. The Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. Then he goes on further and actually does what he's talking about. Because he's talking to Moses after Moses prays and asks God to show him his glory. And then when he does it, in Exodus 34, it talks about it. Starting in verse 5. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with Moses and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious Lord, or God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. Because the thing of it that he ends up sharing here ends up being just the realities of who he is. He's not going to spruce himself up to look better. He's not going to say, I'm going to always be this or that. And the truth of the matter is that as anybody who's sharing the gospel, the truth is the truth, and you should never change it because it's going to be more acceptable one way or the other. We talked at the beginning about this, about what it took for God to finally move into a place where he's going to demolish an entire population. That is a lot. That's a lot to have to That's a lot to have to happen in order to finally get him to move in such a way. Dang it. Anyway, I didn't even make that connection. Anyway,
He did.
the thing is that it has to go that far, and until that point in time, we're left with the faithfulness and the maintaining forgiveness, the maintaining for love and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. The truth is that when we come to know who God is, we find that He is so incredibly patient with us.
Mhm.
You know, even if the language is harsh in the books of the prophets, how long did God spend watching the Israelites commit to this pattern of coming to Him when they were in trouble, then turning their backs as soon as they were safe, going back to their old ways, getting in trouble, coming back to Him,
Mhm.
saying they were going to change their ways, and then doing this over and over and over again. You can think that, you know, that would probably be something that you wouldn't sit through. I mean, nobody should, yet God did. He sat through it for a long, long time, generation after generation, and He wasn't quiet about it. The whole time He's sending these prophets and saying, guys, stop. You're doing this. This is what's going to come from this. Okay? Come back to me and I'm going to do this. I want this to happen. I want to make this happen. But it was incumbent on them coming back to Him, and they never really did. It's why there are so many prophecies in the books, in the prophets, that didn't come to pass. Because a lot of them, when you read the context of them, a lot of them hinge on if you come back to me. And that's the thing, is it was always about relationship. And it continues to be about relationship. We end up going to 1 John 4 a lot in this group. And specifically the line, there is no fear in love. Because fear has to do with punishment. And the thing is that I have seen God protect people from the consequences of their actions so many times, if only for them to understand that He doesn't want them to come to Him because they're afraid. He wants them to come to Him out of love. And when we talk about the freedom of will here, you know, He'll wait through that. Because the truth is that, you know, you can't choose to love somebody if you don't have the freedom to choose to love them. That's the thing about free will. And that's also the truth about love. You have to choose. It has to be something that you want to do. Even a lot of people I've heard talk about how they can't help but love some other person. Like, they can in a way. It's just oftentimes they don't want to control that. There are a lot of women in bad relationships because they love the person that they're with, and they want to love the person that they're with. They just maybe don't always want to admit that that's really where they're at. If they don't have to take
You mean
responsibility.
like if they're abusive?
Right. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's all they know, you know, it's,
Yeah.
change sucks.
Yeah. It's scary. So, in lieu of that, and even another thing, like, to go along with that, sometimes people wonder what the worst sin is. And, like, the church has made a career of, you know, changing what the worst sin is based on society at any particular time. We made it out like homosexuality was the worst sin for a long time. And that was way wrong. But the biggest thing is idolatry. Or not idolatry. Well, yes, it is idolatry, but adultery. is the biggest one. And in a lot of ways, you know, for God, those are one and the same. Because when he talks about sins in terms of us, like one of the worst things that we can do to one another is to be adulterous to one another, to cheat on your spouse. You've made commitments to one another. You've said to each other, you are the one for the rest of our lives. You're the one. And then you've gone back on that. And idolatry for God ends up being much the same. It's that same breaking of relationship that says, you know, you were here, and then you changed your mind.
Mhm.
And I understand.
I love you, but I got a thing I gotta do because that is more fun right now.
Or
Or appealing.
I like that one better. And it's like, there's a big difference in this between, you know, people that have never known God and people that have known God, and that's why it ends up being such a big thing. It's not the ones that have never known him that hurt him, it's the ones that have known him. And I specify the known thing because there are a lot of Christians who've never known God. Not ever. Not really. Maybe they wanted to, but they've never gotten the chance, not yet.
Yeah. That's why like the worst betrayals come from the people that you're the closest to. It's because there's an opportunity for like more damage and pain when it's somebody that you know deeply and you've had all these experiences with and you trust them.
Yeah.
And then they hurt you. It hurts more than anything, any stranger that does something horrible
Yes.
to you. And it's the same with God.
Yeah.
He has feelings.
Yeah. Like, that
I
ends
know
it.
people don't talk about that much, but it's true.
Yeah.
He's passionate for us.
Yeah.
Looking
And
nice.
that's a big thing.
Yeah.
So, you know, we'll pray for, in this particular vein, about even just experiencing him. But that's all I've got.